At 7:43 on the night of the Sterling Foundation Gala, I found an envelope beneath my tablet that nobody admitted putting there. The ballroom at the Langham was already filling with donors, politicians, and executives who expected the evening to appear effortless, while I stood behind a floral display solving a seating problem involving a senator and his former business partner. Inside the envelope was one sheet of hotel stationery, folded around a printed screenshot from Sterling Holdings' scheduling system showing that my executive calendar had been exported at 2:14 that morning. A sentence had been typed beneath it. Before Monday, someone is going to make this look like you helped Sterling steal the Halcyon deal. Do not trust the first person they blame. Monday was the day our board expected to approve the largest hotel acquisition in company history, and it was also the day Victoria had mysteriously blocked 45 minutes on my calendar without explanation. I folded the page into my evening bag, looked across the room for Gabriel, and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. I said nothing. For 3 years, Gabriel had trusted me with everything that could destroy his schedule and most things that could damage his company, which made silence feel almost physical between my ribs. I knew where he would be before he did, which directors could not sit together, which lender needed reassurance before a meeting, and which 5-minute delays would become $5 million problems if I ignored them. What Gabriel did not know was how I took my coffee, what music I played while driving home, or why I declined every invitation that required me to leave my phone somewhere I could not hear it. That distinction had never bothered me until Victoria appeared beside me, carrying the garment bag I had left upstairs, and told me I was attending dinner rather than working through it. 20 minutes later, I returned wearing a plum dress instead of my usual black suit, and the absence of my professional uniform made me strangely aware of how completely I had learned to disappear inside competence. Daniel noticed first, smiled without inspecting me, and told me I looked beautiful with the ease of someone who did not expect the compliment to purchase anything. Daniel was outside counsel for one of our hotel divisions, smart enough not to advertise it constantly, and relaxed in a way nobody around Gabriel ever seemed to remain for long. He asked whether I wanted a drink after the gala, and I had just told him maybe when the room changed with the almost invisible adjustment that always announced Gabriel's arrival. People did not scatter for him, because Gabriel disliked theatrical displays of power, but conversations shortened and paths opened before he reached them. He greeted Victoria, shook the mayor's hand, acknowledged 2 donors, then saw me and lost the rhythm of his own entrance for perhaps 2 seconds. I had watched him receive news of failed financing without blinking, yet the sight of me wearing a dress apparently required recalculation. Daniel followed his gaze, murmured something about my boss lowering the temperature in the ballroom, and laughed just before Gabriel reached us. Gabriel barely looked at Daniel before asking me a question so inappropriate that I initially assumed I had heard him incorrectly. "Who are you dressed for?" he said, quietly enough to spare us an audience, but directly enough that Daniel's smile disappeared. I told him that was not a work question, expecting him to retreat behind professionalism, yet he admitted that he knew exactly what kind of question it was. When he asked whether I planned to leave with Daniel after the gala, irritation finally overcame surprise, and I reminded him that he paid for my professional judgment rather than ownership of the hours after 10. Gabriel's jaw tightened, though he did not raise his voice or reach for authority, and when I asked why any of this mattered to him, he gave me an answer more unsettling than jealousy. He said he did not know, then looked genuinely angry with himself for discovering a feeling before finding language respectable enough to contain it. I told him to figure it out before questioning me again, and for once he accepted a boundary without trying to improve it. Daniel returned with my coat a few minutes before 10, and I left with him, while Gabriel remained in the ballroom preparing to introduce the foundation's keynote speaker. At a small hotel bar 3 blocks away, Daniel ordered bourbon, I ordered club soda, and we spent an hour talking about terrible conference coffee, his sister in Milwaukee, my weakness for old Motown records, and absolutely nothing that required me to solve a crisis. I enjoyed him, but part of my mind kept returning to the envelope in my bag and the possibility that somebody inside Sterling had used my calendar to gain information about Halcyon's competing bidders. Before Daniel walked me to my car, he asked whether I wanted to see him again, and I said yes, because I meant it rather than because the answer was strategically convenient. 4 traffic lights later, I finally checked my work phone and found an email from an address composed of meaningless numbers. The message contained no attachment this time, only 6 words that turned the quiet inside my car into something dangerous. The export was made with your credentials. I arrived at Sterling before 7 the next morning and changed my password before I removed my coat, although I knew enough about enterprise systems to understand that stolen credentials rarely became innocent because their owner typed something new. The visible security history showed no export at 2:14, which meant the screenshot was fabricated, the record had been removed, or someone had accessed a logging layer I could not see. I printed the 2 legitimate calendar access requests I had received that month, both from corporate development, then locked them beside the anonymous note, instead of forwarding anything through systems I no longer completely trusted. Malcolm, the executive leading the Halcyon acquisition, had requested broader visibility twice and complained when I limited him to specific meeting windows, claiming he could not coordinate negotiations efficiently without understanding Gabriel's movements. I had considered him impatient rather than dangerous, because impatience was practically an executive qualification on our floor. When I carried Gabriel's coffee into his office, however, I found myself wondering how many ordinary irritations became obvious only after someone told you where to look. Gabriel behaved as though the gala had never happened until I turned to leave, when he asked how I took my coffee with an awkwardness that nearly made me laugh. I told him cream, no sugar, then watched him ask what music I liked as though he were collecting evidence against his own ignorance. When he admitted that he was trying to understand how much he did not know about me, I told him the list was probably larger than his 9 o'clock meeting allowed. Gabriel looked at the coffee I had placed precisely where he preferred it, then admitted he could describe my work habits in humiliating detail while knowing almost nothing about what I enjoyed once work ended. I should have appreciated the effort, but the anonymous warning made every new question feel slightly contaminated by timing. Before he could ask another, Victoria summoned me upstairs, where a leather folder waited beside a view of the river and an offer I had spent years believing would prove I mattered. The title was Chief of Staff, the salary was almost twice mine, and the authority described on the first pages was everything I had once wanted, while sitting outside rooms where senior men made decisions I later had to repair. Then I reached the availability provisions, emergency travel language, restrictions on outside professional commitments, and vaguely defined expectations for after-hours access. Victoria called them standard protections for an unusually demanding role, but I asked why a promotion needed contractual language describing more ways the company could reach me. She reminded me that indispensable people earned influence because leadership trusted them with responsibilities other employees could not carry. My mother had once called me her easy child for similar reasons, because I remembered groceries, appointments, birthdays, and emotional weather before anyone else noticed a storm approaching. I had spent years hearing words like dependable and mature as affection, without asking whether people loved me or simply relaxed when I was nearby. I told Victoria I wanted outside counsel to review the agreement before Monday. I carried the folder back downstairs, and Gabriel noticed it untouched on my desk before the afternoon ended, which led to an argument neither of us had intended to have. He said the new role fixed the mismatch between my authority and responsibilities, while I told him doubling my salary did not make permanent availability healthier. Gabriel pointed out that he had never ordered me to cancel vacations or family dinners, and I admitted that was why blaming him entirely would have been dishonest. I had volunteered for every rescue until the company learned not to build another option, while he rewarded the arrangement because my constant availability made his life extraordinarily efficient. When I reminded him that my sister had stopped expecting me at Sunday dinners and that I had not taken 7 consecutive days away from work in 3 years, he looked genuinely shaken rather than strategically apologetic. He asked what I wanted if the title disappeared, and I surprised myself by saying I wanted to build systems that still functioned after the most competent person went home. That evening, Gabriel told me not to sign the contract until the availability provisions were rewritten, then ruined the progress by insisting the role itself still belonged inside Sterling. I told him he was doing it again, converting something I wanted into a problem he could solve without asking whether I wanted his solution. He apologized badly, which meant he argued with 2 of my words before admitting I was right about the rest, and the imperfection made the exchange feel more honest than his polished investor speeches. I almost showed him the anonymous messages before my phone vibrated against the desk with another email from the same address. This one contained a photograph of Halcyon's chairman leaving a private restaurant 10 days earlier, followed by a screenshot showing Malcolm's assistant asking me to hold Gabriel's evening free at the exact time. Beneath both images was a warning. Someone used your calendar to know that meeting would happen, but the person using the information did not steal your password. I looked through the glass wall toward Malcolm's darkened office and realized the first message had not been describing the crime. It had been describing the frame. Saturday morning, I met Daniel at a diner in Lincoln Park and gave him the Chief of Staff agreement because discussing employment law allowed me to ask questions without admitting how frightened I had become. He marked 3 clauses, told me Victoria's language was aggressive rather than unusual, then noticed that I was barely listening and asked what I was withholding. I showed him printed access requests and described the anonymous messages without handing over the screenshots because I still did not know whether the sender was protecting me or steering me toward a convenient suspect. Daniel stopped eating and explained that calendar metadata could reveal lenders, regulators, sellers, advisors, and meeting patterns valuable enough to alter negotiations even without exposing the substance of a single conversation. He also told me not to investigate further on my own, because once litigation or a regulatory inquiry became foreseeable, evidence preservation mattered more than satisfying curiosity. I promised nothing, which earned me the disappointed look attorneys reserve for clients determined to become examples in future training seminars. As we were leaving, Malcolm entered the diner with a woman I recognized from a private equity firm financing one of Halcyon's rival bidders. He saw us, paused just long enough to reveal surprise, then walked toward a rear booth while continuing a conversation that suddenly appeared important enough to keep his face turned away. The encounter proved nothing, especially because Chicago's business community could make a city of millions feel embarrassingly small, but Malcolm had told Gabriel's strategy team he would spend the weekend in New York. Daniel quietly wrote down the time rather than photographing anyone, explaining that a witnessed observation was useful while amateur surveillance could create unnecessary complications. I wanted certainty badly enough to resent his caution, which told me caution was probably exactly what I needed. Before we separated, Daniel told me that independence did not require handling every threat alone. I knew he meant it kindly, yet the sentence followed me home because I had spent so long defining usefulness as strength that receiving help still felt suspiciously like losing control. Monday morning answered part of the mystery before I could decide whom to trust with it. At 8:17, an industry publication reported that Sterling might have gained improper advantage in the Halcyon acquisition through confidential scheduling information, mentioning my access to Gabriel's calendar without directly accusing me of misconduct. Within 20 minutes, a gossip site paired the allegation with a photograph from the gala showing Gabriel staring at me in the Plum dress, turning a corporate ethics question into a story about an executive assistant sleeping her way into influence. My face went hot as I read comments from strangers who knew nothing about the nights, missed holidays, or thousands of decisions behind my job, yet felt perfectly qualified to explain what kind of woman earned proximity to power. Gabriel arrived before I closed the page, already carrying the particular calm that meant he had begun making decisions faster than everyone around him could challenge them. He told me legal had taken control of external communication, which was sensible, then informed me that security would escort me everywhere until further notice. I asked what everywhere meant, and Gabriel told me my public meetings were canceled, a driver had been assigned, my home address was being scrubbed from data brokers, and my sister had already been told dinner would need to move. The last detail hit me harder than the article, because nothing in the story contained a direct threat and nothing justified contacting my family without asking me. When I told him to reverse the cancellations, he refused, saying he would rather have me furious than exposed while someone inside the company was manipulating information around my name. I accused him of using fear to justify control, and he answered that protecting me was not control when the risk was real. The argument escalated until Gabriel ordered security not to let me leave the building without an escort, and the moment he said it, both of us understood he had crossed a line he could not rename afterward. I took my coat anyway, and when the guard hesitated between Gabriel's instruction and physically blocking an employee who had committed no offense, I told Gabriel that if he forced the issue, my next call would be to Daniel. He stepped aside, but anger had already broken something that apology could not repair while we were standing inside it. I went directly to outside counsel, preserved the anonymous emails with Daniel present, then filed a formal report through Sterling's audit committee rather than Gabriel's executive chain. The committee retained an independent forensic firm that afternoon, and by evening my work devices had been imaged. Malcolm's access had been frozen without explanation, and a litigation hold prevented anyone from casually deleting records. Gabriel texted once asking whether I was safe, then again 20 minutes later asking why I had not answered, before finally writing that he understood why he had no right to demand one. I slept badly and arrived Tuesday expecting hostility, but instead found my access temporarily limited like everyone else connected to Halcyon. At 11, the forensic team reported something that removed the easiest explanation. My password had never been used at 2:14 because the export had been created through a delegated service account authorized months earlier by an executive officer. Only 4 people could have approved that service account, and one of them was Victoria, which changed the investigation from uncomfortable to personal. She entered the audit committee conference room without counsel and admitted authorizing temporary scheduling integration for corporate development 6 weeks earlier after Malcolm complained that deal coordination was failing. Her approval had specified a 48-hour expiration, but the account remained active because someone altered the service ticket after it passed through information technology. The forensic investigators refused to speculate about who had changed it, which frustrated Gabriel enough that he began questioning the technician directly until the audit chair told him to leave the room. He argued that the company was his responsibility and received the unpleasant answer that his involvement was precisely why independence mattered. Watching Gabriel forced outside a problem involving me should have satisfied something petty inside me. Yet mostly it showed how frightened he became when authority could no longer protect the people he cared about. The anonymous sender revealed herself the next afternoon, not because she had conveniently solved the case, but because outside investigators discovered that compliance analyst Serena had downloaded access logs shortly before the article appeared. Serena arrived with her own lawyer and admitted contacting me after her supervisor dismissed 2 reports about unusual overnight exports, though she had deliberately overstated parts of her first message because she wanted me frightened enough to preserve evidence. She did not know who had altered the account or why Malcolm wanted the calendar, and she had no proof that my name would be blamed until the publication contacted Sterling, asking questions obviously shaped around my role. Her decision had protected evidence while also steering me through fear, and I told her I understood why she had done it without pretending I appreciated being manipulated. Serena looked exhausted when she apologized, then handed the investigators copies of the reports her supervisor had refused to escalate. For the first time, the mystery had a credible witness rather than a perfectly informed guardian angel. Finding motive took another 9 days, 2 subpoenas, outside forensic accounting, and a development none of us predicted. Malcolm had not been secretly working for Halcyon's rival, as I had assumed after seeing him at the diner. He had been feeding selected scheduling clues to an investment consultant who held undisclosed financial interests tied to both sides of the bidding process. The consultant could anticipate Sterling's timing, pressure Halcyon for a higher valuation, and position-related debt before negotiation milestones became public, while Malcolm expected a share of the resulting profits through an entity registered to his brother-in-law. My calendar had become useful because meetings with lenders and board members exposed when Gabriel intended to move, yet Malcolm needed a scapegoat once Serena began asking about access. The gala photograph gave him one, because rumors about my relationship with Gabriel could make unauthorized information flow look intimate rather than technical. Investigators eventually connected Malcolm to the story through deleted messages recovered from a company-managed tablet, not through a magical prepaid phone or a single convenient receipt. Malcolm was placed on leave, then terminated after the evidence was presented to the board, while federal investigators received the forensic record through counsel. The Halcyon acquisition survived only after Sterling disclosed the access failure to the seller, accepted a delay, and agreed to independent review, costing the company money and nearly costing Gabriel the deal. Several directors wanted to describe Malcolm as a rogue employee and avoid discussing the culture that had allowed one executive to request extraordinary access without meaningful resistance. Gabriel initially supported that narrower response, arguing that no policy could prevent every determined liar, and I watched him retreat toward the version of leadership that treated responsibility like liability language. 2 days later, After 3 department heads admitted they routinely bypassed controls because Gabriel rewarded speed, he changed his recommendation and accepted broader reform. Growth did not arrive gracefully. Sometimes it arrived after a person defended the wrong position in a room full of witnesses. The article was corrected, the gossip story disappeared, and none of that made me forget Gabriel telling security I could not leave without his permission. He apologized privately first, then again in writing after I told him remorse that depended on my forgiveness was another form of pressure. He admitted that when my name appeared in public, he had stopped thinking about what I wanted and started thinking only about what he could prevent, because prevention had always felt safer to him than uncertainty. I told him understanding the reason did not reduce the violation, and he agreed without asking me to soften the word. That Friday, I placed my resignation letter on his desk, explaining that I had written the first version before the scandal because I already suspected I wanted another life. Gabriel looked at the envelope for a long time before asking whether there was anything he could change that would make me stay. And when I said no, he did the hardest thing I had ever watched him do. He believed me. My final month at Sterling was less romantic than leaving powerful men tends to look in fiction, because most departures involve spreadsheets, passwords, documentation, and people discovering how many processes were stored inside someone else's memory. Gabriel approved 3 new operations roles instead of replacing me with another heroic assistant, while department heads received decision limits that forced them to stop sending routine problems upward. The changes created missed meetings, duplicate work, and several days when I wanted to reclaim responsibilities simply because watching others perform them imperfectly made my skin itch. I had spent years solving problems before anyone noticed them, and allowing another person to struggle through one felt almost irresponsible, even when struggle was how capability developed. During my last week, a director called me at 9:30 at night about a hotel vendor issue, and I stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. He solved it himself 19 minutes later, which was both irritating and deeply satisfying. Gabriel did not use the transition period to persuade me, though once, after an 18-hour board session, he appeared at my desk and admitted he wanted to. I told him wanting something did not obligate him to act on it, and he laughed because 6 months earlier, he would have heard that sentence as a challenge rather than information. Our conversations remained awkward, occasionally sharp, and more honest because neither of us could pretend the unresolved attraction had disappeared merely because the employment relationship was ending. He told me his father had measured loyalty through sacrifice, giving trusted people more responsibility until leaving became proof of betrayal, and Gabriel had spent years congratulating himself for never issuing those threats aloud. I admitted I had provided the perfect partner for that system because I associated being needed with being safe. Neither confession excused what we had done to each other, but they stopped us from simplifying the story into one powerful man and one innocent employee. 3 weeks after I left, I registered Brooks Operations Group from a folding table beside my apartment window and immediately discovered that independence included software fees, insurance forms, unanswered sales calls, and a terrifying amount of uncertain income. My first client was a restaurant group whose founder proudly told me nothing significant happened without his approval, expecting the statement to impress me. I asked what happened if he became ill for a month, and his silence became the beginning of a 10-week project involving managers, approval limits, documented workflows, and the first vacation he had taken since his daughter entered middle school. Serena joined me 2 months later after Sterling's audit committee protected her whistleblower status, and she decided she wanted work where raising concerns was part of the job rather than a career hazard. On her first Saturday with the company, I sent her 4 messages about a client emergency before remembering exactly what kind of boss I had promised not to become. She answered the first question, ignored the next 3, and told me Monday morning that my written values apparently slept later than my anxiety. I was embarrassed enough to become defensive, explaining that the client had threatened to cancel, before hearing Gabriel's voice in my own insistence that urgency justified taking control of another person's time. I apologized, created an on-call rotation before the next weekend, and paid Serena for the Saturday work without calling the correction evidence of personal transformation. People rarely change in a straight line, which was probably why Gabriel's absence from my life mattered more than any speech he could have delivered. Victoria occasionally told me he had rewritten executive availability rules, accepted stricter access controls, and lost 2 board allies after refusing to weaken the reforms once the scandal faded. I wanted to call him every time she mentioned his name, but wanting contact was not the same as being ready for it. By month 6, Brooks' operations group had 9 clients, 2 employees, and enough recurring revenue that I stopped opening the banking app before coffee every morning. Daniel and I had gone on 2 more dates before admitting we liked each other more comfortably as friends, especially after he confessed that the uncertainty of my new life made him anxious in ways he had initially disguised as sensible advice. He had never wanted to make me smaller, but he preferred the version of me whose future looked predictable, and good intentions did not magically make that preference right for me. My sister began expecting me at Sunday dinner again, though she threatened to confiscate my phone after I checked a client message beneath the table during dessert. I was still learning, which felt healthier than pretending I had graduated from every bad habit because I had changed employers. Then an invitation arrived for the Midwest Operations Council Gala, where I would speak about sustainable growth inside a ballroom, uncomfortably similar to the one where Gabriel first looked at me, as though I were something other than an answer. I bought another plum dress because avoiding a color seemed like granting too much authority to a memory, and I arrived determined not to scan the room for him. For almost an hour, that determination worked while I spoke with manufacturers, founders, and 2 potential clients who cared more about my work than my connection to Sterling. Then the movement around the ballroom changed behind me, subtle enough that I recognized Gabriel before turning. I finished the conversation I was having, exchanged cards, and promised to send a proposal Monday, while every old instinct urged me to reorganize the moment around his arrival. When I finally looked toward him, Gabriel stood near the entrance in a charcoal suit, watching without approaching because another person still had my attention. He waited until I nodded before crossing the room. That small pause did not prove he had changed, but it made me willing to hear what came next. Gabriel stopped several feet away, looked at the plum dress, and smiled with enough embarrassment to make the memory between us feel survivable, rather than romanticized. He asked whether the color was intentional, and I told him I had considered sending the receipt to his therapist if he reacted badly. Gabriel laughed, then congratulated me on the company and mentioned Serena's work without implying that he deserved credit for either of us becoming successful after Sterling. We talked about my panel, his foundation, Victoria's increasingly public complaints about decentralized authority, and several ordinary things that would once have felt impossible to fit between us. A consultant from my panel waved toward me from the bar, and Gabriel glanced over before asking whether I had come with someone. I raised an eyebrow, and he immediately realized how close he had walked to the question that started everything. He rubbed the back of his neck, something I had never seen him do during 3 years of negotiations, then tried again without dressing the moment in perfect language. "I'm asking because I'd like to take you to dinner, and I don't want to ask if somebody else is waiting for you." I told him nobody was, then asked what would happen if the answer had been yes. Gabriel looked briefly uncomfortable, before saying he would probably dislike it, behave politely, and complain to Victoria later, because apparently growth had limits. The answer made me laugh harder than the elegant response I had once imagined him giving, because jealousy had not disappeared, and did not need to disappear for respect to exist. He asked about Friday, rather than that evening, after noticing my event badge and the clients still waiting to speak with me. I checked my own calendar before saying 7 worked, and neither of us pretended the ordinary act lacked history. Dinner happened at a crowded Italian place in the West Loop, where Gabriel had deliberately declined a private room because he was tired of arranging every environment before entering it. He asked about my business, my sister Serena, and whether I still played Motown while preparing client reports, then listened without converting my answers into information he could use later. When I asked about Sterling, he admitted decentralizing the executive office had initially been a disaster, because people who had spent years waiting for permission did not become decisive simply because somebody updated an organizational chart. He had nearly reversed the entire project during the 2nd month after 2 costly errors, and Victoria stopped him by asking whether he wanted independent leaders or merely obedient people who performed independence correctly on the first attempt. He told me that story without making himself the hero, which mattered more than any polished declaration about learning to let go. We dated cautiously for the next several months, and caution proved less boring than either of us expected, because affection had room to become specific once neither person needed a dramatic rescue. Gabriel still had controlling instincts, especially when he was frightened, and once arranged a car after my flight was canceled without asking because a winter storm stranded me in Detroit. I snapped at him before learning he had only reserved the option and had not given the driver my location, while he admitted he had spent 10 minutes arguing with himself about whether even making the reservation crossed a line. I sometimes overcorrected in the opposite direction, refusing help simply because accepting it made me afraid of dependence, until Serena pointed out that autonomy was not a competition to see who could need nobody longest. We disappointed each other, apologized badly, tried again, and discovered that healthy relationships contained fewer grand victories than repeated small corrections nobody applauded. The Halcyon investigation ended almost a year after the gala, when Malcolm entered a plea involving fraud and unauthorized disclosure of confidential corporate information, while Sterling accepted regulatory penalties for its access control failures. Gabriel's lawyers had advised fighting part of the settlement, but he chose not to challenge findings the independent audit had already shown were fair, even though the decision cost him support from directors who preferred innocence defined as the absence of criminal intent. Serena's original reports became part of Sterling's compliance training, including the embarrassing fact that management had ignored them because the person raising concerns lacked seniority. Victoria told me afterward that the company had finally learned systems were supposed to protect people from powerful personalities, including well-meaning ones. I understood why that lesson mattered, but I also knew corporations did not become moral because they adopted better policies. They simply created fewer excuses for individuals to avoid making moral choices. 1 year after our first disastrous gala, I returned to the Langham as the founder of a company hired to redesign the foundation's grant operations, which meant I entered through the same doors without carrying Gabriel's schedule. Near the end of the evening, he found me beside the windows and asked whether I wanted him to wait until I finished or meet me at home later, because I still had 2 conversations left. I told him to go ahead, and some younger part of me expected disappointment, persuasion, or at least the subtle pressure powerful people learn to disguise as preference. Gabriel kissed my forehead, reminded me that there was leftover pasta in the refrigerator, and left while I remained exactly where I had chosen to be. When I finished an hour later, I found one message asking whether I wanted tea or wine, with no second message asking why I had not answered. For most of my life, I had believed love was easiest to recognize when somebody could not manage without me, because usefulness gave me a place that seemed impossible to lose. Gabriel had believed something equally dangerous from the other side, that protecting what mattered meant reducing every uncertainty until nobody he loved could move beyond his reach. Neither of us had been cured by one resignation, one scandal, or one beautiful apology, and I was grateful for that, because real change had turned out to be slower and much less photogenic. I left the ballroom when I was ready, drove home without checking anybody else's calendar, and found Gabriel in the kitchen burning the garlic bread because he had ignored the timer while reading. He looked up and asked whether my night had been good, without asking why I had taken so long. I kissed him before answering, not because he needed me there, and not because I needed him waiting, simply because, after everything, we were both still free to choose the same room.